Welcome to today's panel in the JRSA Fall Criminology Series, Approaches to Examining Long-Term Recidivism of Sex Offenders. My name is Susan Howley, and I am on staff here at the Justice Research and Statistics Association. We're so glad to have the opportunity to share this terrific panel with you all today. Today's presentation is supported with funding from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, Office of Justice Programs at the U.S. Department of Justice. However, the views expressed today are those of the panelists and do not necessarily represent those of the Department of Justice. And now I'd like to invite our panel discussant, Matt Durose from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, to say a few words to introduce this session. Matt?
Thank you, Susan. This panel includes three very interesting projects that each bring their own unique approach to examining recidivism, while also sharing some common attributes as it relates to the cohorts and the lengths of the follow-up period. The first presentation includes a research team from Maine and Massachusetts. That will then be followed by a presentation from Washington State, and the last presentation focuses on sex offenders from Michigan. Following the presentation, we will have time to continue discussion with questions from the webinar attendees. So, Susan, I will send it back to you, and George and Lisa to start the panel.
Great, thank you so much. Our first presentation is by George Shaler, the director of the Maine Statistical Analysis Center, which is part of the Muskie School of Public Service at the University of Southern Maine, and Lisa Laurent Sampson. She's the director of Research and Policy Analysis and the Massachusetts Statistical Analysis Center at the Office of Grants and Research, Executive Office of Public Safety and Security in Massachusetts. George and Lisa, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Susan. I appreciate it. Lisa and I are going to start off here by talking about some of the challenges. So you won't get much in terms of results with our project, but we thought it was interesting to kind of discuss some of the challenges of doing this type of research across state lines. Lisa and I became very interested in working on a joint project together since we are New England SACs, if you will, Statistical Analysis Centers, and we thought it would be interesting to kind of see how, if there was any kind of sex offender recidivism happening across state lines between Maine and Massachusetts. And for those of you that may be wondering, well, Maine and Massachusetts don't share a border. We are separated by about 17 miles of New Hampshire. But we thought it would be interesting to kind of see what, if any, recidivism occurred among sex offenders being released from Maine and maybe possibly recidivating down in Massachusetts and vice versa. So as well as what the recidivism rates were, sex offender recidivism rates and recidivism rates in general within state as well. So this is kind of a short discussion about what has happened to date and some of the challenges in doing this kind of research. So I will jump in here and I will pass it off to Lisa at a couple of points during this part of the presentation. Anyway, so working together again to study the recidivism rates of sex offenders who were released from commitment in Maine and Massachusetts. And both SACs are making use of criminal history records in their respective states to track any kind of subsequent arrest and or conviction among the cohort members. And criminal history records from each state will be shared with our respective, amongst our respective SACs to kind of see if there is any kind of criminal history activity. So in other words, if someone has been released from a Maine Department of Corrections facility during the study period, and we will share that identifier, that ID, with our Massachusetts colleagues to see if they appear in any kind of criminal history records that are captured down in Massachusetts and vice versa. So let's see. So the analysis will focus on our cohort members categorized by the offender type, were they arrested and convicted of a subsequent sex offense, any violent offense, and any other type of offense. So we're looking at recidivism in 3 ways. Again, whether there was a subsequent sex offense, violent offense, or any other type of offense. So I'm going to let Lisa jump in here and add some comments here if I can negotiate this. Drag the ball down here.
Oh, you don't have to drag the ball.
Oh, I don't have to drag. Sorry. Go ahead, Lisa.
Hi, everybody. My name is Lisa Sampson. Nice to be with you all here this afternoon. So, wanted to talk a little bit just about in Massachusetts, the way we're going to be pulling records or looking at records in Massachusetts. Because our criminal history records are not fingerprint supported, we're going to be using name, date of birth, and different deviations of that. So that's one point I want to make. Also, that in Massachusetts, we know that that we can pick up probation if someone's released to probation, the term of probation in Massachusetts, and they are being supervised in the community. We will see that information in our criminal history records. One gap is that we won't, through our criminal history records, be able to pick up if someone's a parole violator. Obviously, if they have a new arrest, and that arrest would get picked up in the criminal history records. But if they're a parole violator and it's more of a technical violation, there will be a gap in terms of that information. So we'll probably be looking to get that information from our parole board and determine the parole violation information.
Thank you, Lisa. Let's move on to the next slide. So, so the way this is going to work, and what we've been trying to work on, and we've been delayed for a variety of reasons, which we'll get into a little bit later. We've been trying to obtain cohort data from our respective Department of Corrections. That is, the people who were released for a sex offense from 2009 to 2018. And records will be obtained for all those offenders released from a prison and those going to probation through 2009 and 2018. And then we will share that information, with the Search Institute, who's helping us match identifiers in both the Maine and Massachusetts criminal history records to see if there's any kind of subsequent offending. So these are our data requests, and I'm going to read the main. I'm going to go over the main ones, and Lisa's going to talk about the Massachusetts one. So again, we're obtaining a cohort from the Maine Department of Corrections. We're ascertaining how many members were arrested for any kind of subsequent offense through the Maine Department of Public Safety's criminal history record repository. And then we're also going to ideally determine if any Massachusetts cohort members were arrested in Maine by offense type. And again, we'll be looking to the Maine Department of Public History's criminal history record repository for that information. Lisa, do you want to talk about Massachusetts? Lisa?
Sorry, I was on mute. Sorry about that. So I just want to give a shout out to our Massachusetts Department of Correction colleagues. I think a few of you are out there listening. So they're working now to query the data. We put in a pretty comprehensive request, and we're looking for, what we've asked for is the 2009 through 2018 releases, but we are not just looking at the governing or sort of the primary sex offense, which is normally how, you would pull the data, but we've asked the Department of Correction to actually look at all of the offenses, whether it's concurrent or subsequent sex offenses that the individual was incarcerated for. So that we're going to be pulling our release cohort based on sort of casting that wider net. So for example, if someone was committed for something like attempted murder or manslaughter with a concurrent or subsequent sex offense, based on the governing offense definition, the offender would not have been included in that more traditional sex offender cohort, but we've asked to use this broader definition so the offender will be included. Additionally, we're going to be going through the DOC's. The DOC's inmate management system contains a sex offender registry flag, which is manually set by an internal review of each offender's criminal history, and it includes past and present incarcerations. So if that registry flag indicates that the offender must register with the Sex Offender Registry Board, we've asked the department to include that person in the release cohort. So in this way, we hope to get sort of that wider sex offender release cohort. I think that's it for me, George.
Okay, thanks, Lisa. So here are some of the variables that we're going to be looking at. State identification, probation central file number. That's we'll be making use of that in Massachusetts, and SID up in Maine. Some basic demographic data, offense information for Maine, offense date, arrest dates. You can see some of the other offense information that we're going to be looking at, as well as subsequent offense, arrest, and conviction information for all arrests and offenses, arraignments and offenses in Massachusetts. So this is the way, ideally, we're going to be able to track whether a sex offender has committed any kind of recidivating offense. Let's see here. Now, we are forging some nice partnerships on this project, and so part of this project involves translating the records into a dimensional format and storing them in a relational database. And again, as I said earlier, we're relying on the Search Institute's Open Justice Broker Consortium to help with this process. They have a history of working with criminal history record repositories in the states around the country, and we thought that they would be able to kind of set up the matching criteria a lot quicker than both Lisa and I were able to. So we are going to rely on them for that process. And then ultimately this partnership is focused on bringing consistency into data formats while making it easier for SAC analysts to kind of study and analyze these data. Lisa, do you, oh, I'm sorry, next slide. So what's been challenging about this is that in our respective states, these are somewhat unusual requests to be asking our departments of correction. These are not requests that they typically handle. This has, at least I'll speak for Maine, has stretched their abilities to kind of respond in a timely manner to these type of data requests, even though this was something that in Maine the department was very interested in. We have also dealt with, as is typical in state government, a fair amount of turnover in the positions that we, at least again, I'm speaking here for Maine, that we would be relying on to query their corrections record management system. We've had at least 3 people over the year plus of this project, I should say year and a half plus of this project, leave the position. And right now we are making use of a person who is helped develop the software program that the department, the Maine Department of Corrections uses in inputting all of their information. So we're actually no longer even making use of a DOC person. We're making use of a software person to kind of do the querying. So it's really slowed us down. And we're also making we've had a change in administration since this project started. There's new priorities at the Maine Department of Corrections. So fulfilling this request has been slow, to say the least. So Lisa, I'll let you jump in here on Massachusetts.
Yeah, so on our side in Massachusetts, we've been really fortunate that we came, I think we were going to piggyback originally, so, we were going to get the Maine data and then move to the Massachusetts, but with the delay in the Maine data, we decided to just, we would step back a little bit, so we decided to just go ahead and request the Mass data, and things are moving along, so we're really fortunate for that. I think I worked for the Massachusetts Department of Correction prior to coming to the Massachusetts back, and so I have, strong familiarity with the data, and so I was able to write, a really, very comprehensive sort of review, or not review, but, elements about, of the data that we'd be looking for, and, provide some really clear criteria. So that really helps. And it's a luxury. It's not, I'm working with the Sex Offender Registry Board also, and that is data that I am not familiar with, and trying to see if we'd be able to get some information from the Sex Offender Registry Board about county offenders that are released to the community. So in Massachusetts, we have a county correctional system that can, where offenders can serve sentences up to 2.5 years. And these are run, the county sheriff's departments are run, and they're independently elected sheriffs. So, we do not in Massachusetts have a centralized database from which we can pull this county House of Correction data. And, there would be a significant gap if we can't find a source of data for those county offenders. So we're looking at the Sex Offender Registry Board as a possible source, and we're also potentially going to reach out to the parole board, because they also have a very robust database, and we're hoping that we'd be able to get some information about sex offenders released from the county system that way. So, I think there'll be a way to fill in the gaps. But in terms of the Department of Corrections, we've been really fortunate that I think we'll be able to, get a very a nice pool of data from them for the 2009 through 2018 years.
Thank you, Lisa. The Maine data request is pending. Massachusetts will be able to get their data soon. The Search Institute is ready to take the output and match it up with information in the respective criminal history record systems, hopefully. And Search has strong ties to the Maine criminal history record staff, and we're hoping to see that relationship grow with the Massachusetts one. So that's where we are with this work to date, and hopefully, if there's a presentation a year from now, we'll have some data to share. But these are some of the, we wanted to kind of highlight, if you will, some of the challenges in doing this type of research across state lines. So, Susan, I will turn it back to you.
All right, thank you both. Thank you both so much. Folks, I want to remind you that we will be holding questions till the end, but if you have questions for George or Lisa, go ahead and type them in the chat box now so that we don't lose track of them, and we'll be sure to raise them at the end. Our next presenter is Matt Landon. He's the Forecast and Research Analyst at the Washington State Statistical Analysis Center at the Washington Office of Financial Management. And George, if you can just make Matt the presenter, we'll turn to our next presentation.
All right, hello everyone. Hi from the sunny state of Washington, where we are currently experiencing an extreme downpour and windstorm. Really excited to be joining you all, and thanks George and Lisa for that amazing presentation, and best of luck to you as you continue pursuing those data sources. I really appreciate that sort of look that I think all of us who deal with criminal justice data can really relate to on one level or another, especially when you're making that request for data that's slightly unusual, or you go that extra step of trying to connect interstate databases. You run into a whole additional level of complication beyond just what you normally do day to day. And I think it's really valuable to not only know that we're not all alone in facing those struggles, but that there is a good strategy, and with good strategy will eventually come good results. So for now, I want to talk about what Washington looked at for long-term recidivism, specifically of just Washington state sex offenders. With as much as I absolutely respect the work that George and Lisa are doing, I just straight dodged the complexity of interstate tracking, and I will mention that in a bit, but that was not a part of this. We just wanted to look at Washington state sex offenders. So by way of background, this was in response to a 2018 BJS study, which I would guess many of you are familiar with, some perhaps even more so than others. That was done by Mariel Alper, Matt Durose, who is our discussant today, and Joshua Markman. So that study was on a national scale and found that of the roughly 68,000 federal prisoners that they were looking at, about 83% of them were rearrested within 9 years post-release. And that study kind of raised an important question. It's sort of the industry standard almost in criminology to look at recidivism over a 3 to 5 year period. Mostly 5 year. And I think that happens for one of two reasons, based on what I've sort of seen in the literature pondering this. One is that it's an issue of convenience, that it's difficult to get really, really, really long-term samples that also are pertinent to the modern era with the rate at which laws change, the rate at which people's lives change. So that's sort of an issue of convenience, but that's not necessarily theoretically grounded. The other question that comes up with regard to that 5 year follow-up period is, I think, the feeling that after 5 years, recidivism drops off to a level that we don't really care about anymore. Well, this 2018 study from BJS kind of cuts that question open, because they found that those rearrest rates continue through all 9 years. And so to me, I think that raises a further question. Is 9 years the end? At what point does it stop being significant? If it's not 5, where is the best cutoff for research? Or at least the cutoff that we can say, we know things drop off after this point. So sort of in response almost to the BJS study that really kind of provoked our thoughts on the subject, we proposed doing a look specifically at sex offenders in our state. That's always a hot topic here. There's legislation every year looking at this. I know that there's a lot of focus on sex offenders in Washington. So we thought we would kind of take the same approach that BJS did, but we wanted to apply it to a population that is in a lot of focus. So we did that study, got it completed, and it's been posted on our website. We did that back in the beginning of 2020. So the data that we used came from our State Patrol's criminal history data. And the State Patrol also had that data linked to the Washington's sex offender registry. So that was really easy in an almost unfair degree. I want to throw out some acknowledgement to our Washington State Patrol. They are fantastic. Their data folks are incredibly responsive. They heard about the study. We got the paperwork done, and the data transferred over, all linked linked by full name and birth date so that we had, really reasonable confidence that the matching was pretty strong. We knew when folks came in to the registry, and we could track their arrests over that period for a full 15 years. So these were folks in our cohort who basically registered for the first time on the registry between 2000 and 2003. In total, that cohort was 7,683 sex offenders in Washington state. And then we followed that group through 2018. And that means that the folks in 2000, we stopped tracking their data in 2015. The folks in 2003, it ended in 2008. So I'm going to try to stick to saying the word rearrest rather than recidivism, because while this is a recidivism study, rearrest is sort of the broadest possible definition, but we did want to stick to rearrest for one, because it was in that criminal history database, in that core data source we were using, and also because we wanted to make sure we kept consistency with the 2018 BJS study, so to the maximum extent possible, we could compare the metrics and be measuring on the same thing. We also made the decision to remove failure to register as an offense measure because it is sort of a status-based crime among sex offenders. You have to be a sex offender to be able to fail to register. So in any comparison between sex offenders and everyone else, there's an additional arrest that they can have that nobody else possibly can. And because it's also not one that is a direct victim crime, it made sense to us to remove that for the purposes of this study so that it didn't artificially inflate the rates of arrest that we were measuring. And then we added another measure, and this one was a little bit more rough around the edges. I wouldn't take it as precise, but the average risk of arrest for non-cohort members for use in this study was calculated using some census estimates of Washington state adults and the statewide arrest rates excluding the arrests that were measured for cohort members. So anyone who was a non-cohort member, we calculated that by subtracting the number of cohort members from our population estimates and then subtracting the number of arrests that we know were within the cohort. And that measure is going to come up a little bit later. So this shows you a little bit of who was in the cohort. We had sort of an even breakdown between our various age groups, sort of your 18 to 27-year-olds, those folks less likely to have an established life. And this, incidentally, is age at registration. Of course, this being a 15-year-long period, there's nobody who's 18 at the end of the study. We also had our 28 to 40-year-olds and our 41 plus. Then among the risk levels, you can see that the majority of people in this cohort are level 1 risk, and a very small percentage relatively were the highest risk level, about a little under 8%. And then in the total amount of rearrests, from if you take the entire cohort, about 12.5% were arrested at any point in those 15 years for one sex-related crime. Another 48% were arrested at least once, but had no sex-related crimes in that entire period. And then the remaining 39% were not arrested at all in those 15 years. This gives you a breakdown of the years since their initial registration. And I've highlighted a couple numbers in year 5, because as I alluded to, that is our standard for the normal studies cutoff. And so around there, that's where we see the 50% rearrest rate for the cohort. And if you follow that all the way down to the end, by year 15, that has gone up only to about 61%. So about 50% of those arrests have happened, or I should say of all the arrests that occurred, we've gotten 5/6 of them in the first 5 years, and the remainder happens in the remaining 10. I also highlighted, there's a column in here that is the risk of first rearrest. So this essentially is the survival question. Of everyone who has not been arrested yet, what is the risk that this is the year that they get their first rearrest following their initial registration? So in year 5, it's about a 4.5%, a little more than 4.5% chance that they will be rearrested in year 5 for the first time. And then the furthest column over is the risk compared to the calculated average risk of arrest for just anybody in the public. What is just the random risk that they will be arrested if you pick them at random? And the year where the risk for the cohort drops below that average risk level is year 9. After that, it remains beneath there. And what I sort of acknowledge that the average risk level is a little bit of a rough statistic. I wouldn't say that I would quote it as an exact risk, an exact average risk, but it is sort of a benchmark by which we can see that the risk of rearrest for sex offenders in this cohort has sort of dipped below a level that is at least the population average. And that might become a little more clear on a graph that's a couple slides away. One thing I wanted to pull out first, though, there's sort of a statistical truism that floats around and seems to just constantly reappear, the 80-20 rule, and the idea that 20% of a given population often accounts for about 80% of the noise that you're going to hear. That's true in classrooms with students. It's true in group projects and folks doing certain amounts of work. Well, it's also true, it seems, in here that you can see that folks in this cohort, some of them get rearrested once, some 2 to 3 times, some 4 to 5 times, and then there's a certain group that is 6 or more. You have about 23% of our cohort is that 6 or more group, and they make up just under 80% of the arrests. So that drives a lot of the big rearrest numbers that we found during this study. It's a small percentage of the total cohort that makes up the vast majority of rearrests. And that's why we've also sort of pulled out and focused on that first rearrest statistic rather than just rearrests total. Okay, so this is the graph that I've mentioned that sort of gets to the question of when does a cohort's risk normalize? And so this is the risk of being rearrested for the first time. In year 1, that for the whole cohort is about 27.5%. So that means that over a quarter of the people in the cohort were rearrested for the first time in the first year following that initial registration. Then those people were removed from the calculation, and of the remaining cohort who had not been arrested yet, about 15% got that first arrest in the second year, and so on, to the point where we can say roughly about year 8, if you are a person in this cohort who has not gotten rearrested yet, the odds of you being arrested for anything at all are roughly equivalent or perhaps even slightly lower than the total population average risk of arrest. That's what's being conveyed on this graph. And I think sort of at least offers another question into this sort of discussion of long-term recidivism. At which point does the continued measure of recidivism become less useful for policy decisions? Specifically, if we're asking, should we continue monitoring sex offenders for longer periods because we keep seeing arrests within the cohort, this sort of offers an answer, not saying that it's necessarily no, but it gives you a metric by which to compare it to an average sort of normal risk. This same graph breaks up the sex offenders into their risk levels as calculated. So for those who we know their assigned risk level, we have the level 1s, 2s, and 3s. The 3s definitely have a higher risk, at least initially, but that all sort of closes together in the later years when it becomes closer to the average risk level. The caveat there is that there are far fewer level 3s. So by the time that there have been a lot of arrests in the initial years, there aren't a whole lot left, and that becomes a little bit subject to statistical noise and potentially would not represent all other years that are not contained in this study. I've also pulled out a little graph on the offense specialization. This gets a little bit at the question of, are these folks going out and committing new sex offenses, or are they just doing everything else? And the large answer is there are sex offenses, but it's mostly in these rearrests, mostly non-sex offenses. So for those who were rearrested, excluding those who weren't, 20%, maybe a little closer to 21% of those who were rearrested did have at least one new sex offense in those rearrests, and the other 79% did not. But for the full total of rearrests, less than 5% of those rearrests were for a sex-related offense, and over 95% were for something else. So there are more graphs, more statistics, more things that were sort of pulled out. Those are all in the full report. I didn't want to dive fully into everything. I wanted to sort of focus in on some of the more, the larger findings, the things that I thought spoke to the bigger picture. But I think it's also important, as always, to acknowledge some of the limitations of this study. As with almost everything we do, a reliance on official data sources means that we are not accounting for the dark figure of crime, and it's sort of widely known that sex offenses are one of the most underreported crimes. So just because we didn't find a high level of sex offense recidivism does not mean it didn't happen, and it doesn't mean that there is no risk to the public. That's an important point I'd make to anyone looking at policy. Just because it's not observed in official statistics doesn't mean it doesn't happen. It just means we don't see it. The other thing is that, as I mentioned, rearrest is sort of the broadest idea of recidivism. And arrests don't necessarily lead to a conviction. So repeat arrestees, those folks with 6 or more, they could potentially not be getting convictions, or they could be convictions or plea deals for very minor things. So in that sense, this is sort of your broadest look. These are the biggest numbers you're likely to see for sex offender recidivism. If you took it even down to conviction, if you took it to prison, you would get a narrower and narrower percent. And one other thing that I will fully acknowledge, I did not manage to capture. I wanted to get death data, and I did not. I thought that it was included in the sex offender data that I received, and I was mistaken. And so I just have to acknowledge this is a long study period. We know that offenders generally have higher mortality than other groups. So if they died during the study period, that might not have been captured. They wouldn't have been excluded, and that would have inflated some of the cohort in some ways. It would have essentially looked like persistence. It maybe could have been an exclusion or at least a removal at that point. So some quick discussion. The majority of our sex offender rearrests occur in the first several years following that initial registration. That is exactly in line with the sort of trends that were shown in the 2018 BJS study. It's just repeated at a slightly lower rate of percentage in sex offenders. Sex offenses are a fairly small portion of the rearrests that happened, but still a fifth of those who were rearrested had at least one new sex offense. Whether that is high or low, I think is more of a question for policymakers because there are statistical answers to give, but that doesn't really answer a level of public concern. That risk levels do actually appear to predict risk of rearrest, but just in the first few years following the registration, and their predictivity seems to lose a little bit of efficacy over time. That's not necessarily a finding that I would stake a whole ton on just on this because we didn't do a lot of additional stuff to test it, but these preliminary looks, just these base level looks at it, certainly seem to support that the risk levels are useful to a point. And in general, I also would suggest that the low increase in the rearrest totals during the later years does challenge to an extent the length of time that sex offenders receive some level of supervision from the criminal justice system. That's not to say that there's no point and that there's no value added, but it does raise a question of how long it is worth following people, both in actual supervision and in studies in criminal justice research, to continue seeing recidivism, rearrests, or anything out of them against when they've sort of reached a normalized level, and while there are still things to observe, they're no more than the population average. So I'm just sort of, that's what we found. I'm leaving that finding out there. That's something for folks to see themselves and decide, you know, whether that's significant to them or there's potentially some challenges, there's some criticisms. I think that's a fine discussion to have. I look forward to any discussion or questions on that a little bit later after our following presentation. And I've also tossed in a web link for anybody who would like to take a look at this study in particular, or anything else from the Washington SAC. I'm always around if you have further questions, thoughts, or discussion after this as well. So thanks for your attention, and I will go ahead and pass this back.
Thank you so much, Matt. And if you can put that link in the chat box, it'll be a lot easier for folks to capture.
Oh, you got it. I'll do that.
Thanks. Our next presentation is a team from the Michigan SAC. That team is led by Ed McGarrell, who's the director of the Michigan Justice Statistics Center. He's also a professor at Michigan State University. He's joined by Dr. Jason Rydberg at the Center for Program Evaluation at the University of Massachusetts Lowell, and Katrina Cole, doctoral teaching fellow at the University of Massachusetts Lowell. And Katrina will be our presenter. Matt, if you can just pass the presenter controls to Katrina, we'll bring the Michigan team up.
Okay, thank you, Susan. Okay, so hello. I just want to begin by reiterating that this was a collaboration between quite a few entities here. So we worked with the Michigan Department of Corrections as well as the Michigan SAC. And so Dr. Rydberg, being a former employee of the Michigan SAC, brought me on so we could work as, take on the analytical capacity with this project. So we have some relatively modest research objectives here with a descriptive analysis of these data. We had originally intended more, but due to restrictions imposed by the pandemic, we decided to keep this particular analysis relatively simple for now. But the data we do have are relatively rich, so we definitely believe that we have a good contribution to this, this knowledge area. So overall, our objectives here are to examine how the likelihood of reoffending varies across different definitions of recidivism. We also have a limited set of covariates to work with, so we're going to take a look at a couple of those and see how patterns of recidivism vary with these covariates. So those involved in applied data analysis know that a vast majority of effort is not spent in analysis, but spent on file cleaning and data aggregation. So I will walk you all through the process we used to work with the data from Michigan. I want to give a shout out to the MDOC that we appreciate them going through considerable effort to set up and extract these data for us. So we're excited to employ our analytic knowledge to these. We do still have a few outstanding questions about what we're looking at, a few intricacies that we're trying to work through, but overall we think that we have taken a principled approach here. So what we have to do is we need to get a complete picture of who's going in and out of prison, what they're going for, and when they leave. And this can't be done with a single data set. So we received two different files. We have one with the sentencing history of offenders and the other documenting their transits in and out of the correction system. So with the sentencing file, there was a lot of information there, but the primary information that we used was about the offense and their arrest and conviction dates. And then with the transit file, there we used their the date of their movements, as well as the source and destination locations, so we could see where they came from and where they were going. And also the reason for a particular transit, like if they were going to court or if they were let out on parole, etc. Now, these are both complex file structures involving repeated observations of unique individuals, which, as you can see from the number of rows of data compared to the number of offenders there. So one of the primary tasks was creating a script in our statistical computing environment that would enable me to get these in a format for survival analysis. So one of our first tasks was to identify the sex offenders. So we had a big list of convictions and a big list of transits, and we first had to go through and identify who in these files was convicted of a sexual offense. So we looked up from the Michigan compiled laws the offenses that would be a registrable sex offense, and matched those with the offense codes in the data file. So we could identify a group of people with, just people with sex offense convictions. Then we identified what their start time at risk would be. This is when they are released into the community, which I will talk about more in a moment. So using the date that would indicate the start of their observation period, we then selected the closest preceding conviction to that release date. So this involves setting up time intervals for each row of data between their conviction and release, and selecting the smallest interval. So we could get the people who, their last conviction before they're released to the community. This also required sorting out any people that had implausible dates, like someone who was sentenced in the year 3000, we had to get rid of them. And then after all that, we were down to about 18,500. And I will say that this cohort of people are those that were released between 2004 and 2019. And I realize that this is a big drop off from the last slide with the number, the total number of individuals. And we can probably get this 18,000 up a bit higher, closer to the original number with some further processing. But for where we are now, we're comfortable with this sample. So what we then had to do was identify a viable start date for each person's observation period. So this is when someone is in the community, potentially at risk of recidivating. So this could include being released from prison, or if they were just put directly on probation. So what we did was we took the transit file and ranked everyone's transits chronologically for each individual. So then we looked at everyone's first 12 transits, if they had that many. Some people had a lot of transits, so to keep it simple for now, we just stuck with the first 12. And then we selected people that had a transit that would indicate release to the community. Now, we do eventually hope to go beyond looking at the first 12, but we just needed to make it more manageable for now. So what transits did we use as indicators of release? So of each person's first 12 transits, they were selected into the sample if one of these transit codes came up. So the first instance of one of these codes was used as an indicator for their observation start date. So this is the date that they are moving into the community and can be considered at risk of recidivism. We then merged these dates with the sentencing history in order to select the conviction that occurred prior to this date. Now, one thing to recognize here is that entries can be recorded in the transit file for a number of reasons. So we had a lot of different categories to dig through to try and accurately identify when people began their period at risk. And so this involved looking at the start and end locations in tandem with the movement conditions to see if they would indicate release or risk to the community. Because some of these reasons in the box on the right, they may indicate release in some instances, but not in all cases. So we had to make some of these contingent on where they came from and where they went to determine that they were being released. Now, we're not sure if this list is perfect, so we would like to get some more feedback on this, but we do believe we took a principled approach here in identifying these individuals released to the community. Now, for our recidivism definition, what we are looking at are people who were detected, arrested, processed in court, and subsequently convicted of the offense. So this is a relatively high degree of criminal justice system processing in our recidivism definition. So this does increase our confidence that we are looking at legitimate recidivism events, but it may be overly sensitive in that we are not counting arrests that didn't result in conviction. But importantly here, the timing of the event that we are using is based on when they were arrested. So we are using recidivism as a new conviction, but the timing of that is based on their arrest. So this is to help mitigate some of the criminal justice system processing time from when the recidivism event took place. Now we have a few different definitions of recidivism. So we conceptualize this based on the type of offense, and we created like a hierarchy. So in the top tier, we have offenses that qualify for sex offender registration. The next tier would be status offenses if, like they indicated, non-compliance, so failure to register, a residency violation. And then the third level, we have offenses of a sexual nature that do not invoke registration requirements. So under Michigan law, these would not put you on the sex offender registry, but they are crimes of a sexual nature. But specifically for our analysis today, we are focusing on recidivism for Tier 1 offenses, so if it would be a registrable sex offense, and just general recidivism, so if they committed any new offense, regardless of what that offense is. So this is our overall hierarchy that we plan to look at more in depth as we go forward. So even though we're just focusing on the top and the bottom of the pyramid today, we did consider this broader hierarchy that's conceptualized in these different levels according to what the reoffending behavior was, and they get increasingly inclusive. So at the second level, we would include both the registrable sex offenses and the failure to comply offenses, and so on. But like I said, we're just focusing on the top and the bottom for today. So in any analysis of survival data, the paramount concern is censoring. This is how to deal with people who don't experience the event of interest, in this case, a new conviction. So we censor people if they didn't have an arrest, and we set that date to the last day of 2019. So they were censored at the end of that year. And then in terms of our recidivism hierarchy, we also censored subjects if they did have a new arrest, but it wasn't for the offense of interest for a given tier of recidivism. So for Tier 1, we censored everyone that committed a failure to comply offense or a non-registrable sex offense of, a non-registrable sex offense. And then this process was repeated for each tier, but then getting to general recidivism, everyone was included as long as they did have a new offense. So we describe our findings using a couple operational definitions. Our analysis is based on describing the hazard function, which is the risk of recidivism at each time point, given survival up to that point. So this enables us to highlight when in a person's observation period recidivism is most likely and least likely to occur. This also describes how the risk of recidivism varies over the course of someone's observation period. We'll also describe the survivor function, which tells us the proportion of a sample that is still active. So that is not recidivated cumulatively up to that point in time. And we'll examine how these functions vary across two covariates, looking at incarceration history and the severity of the original sex offense. And we use discrete time survival regression models to determine whether or not the hazard statistically varies between those groups. So, our results. I'm going to start off with general recidivism, which again is reconviction for any new offense. So on the left, we have the hazard curve, and the height of it is when recidivism is most likely. So this suggests that the probability of recidivism is highest in the first couple years following release, and then declines with time. So the implication here is that the longer someone has been in the community, the less likely they are going to eventually reoffend. Now the survival curve on the right shows that these failures overall add up to about 20% of the sample having a general recidivism event by 10 years post-release. So next we considered how these hazard curves would vary by prior incarceration and the type of sex offense that they were originally convicted of. So Michigan uses a 4-tier system for identifying what is called criminal sexual conduct convictions, where CSC1 is the most serious, and that's basically a penetrative contact offense with some aggravating circumstance, like if the victim was a child. And then they decrease in severity as you go down. And not all of them specifically identified which degree of CSC it was, so those were all just put into the other category. Now, I'll note that there are certain points in the observation period where it seems like the hazard of reoffending is somewhat distinct. So like those with prior incarceration seem to generally have a higher likelihood of recidivism up to about 10 years, where then it crosses over with the no prior incarceration line. But in order to determine whether or not these hazard curves are statistically distinguishable from one another, we can examine the results from our discrete time regression models. So in each case, we observed that the hazard is best fit using a quadratic polynomial, meaning that there is one inflection point in the hazard curve. And in each case, we observed that the hazard of general recidivism does not systematically vary across these groups. So for the criminal sexual conduct, it appears that those with CSC3 up through about 10 years have a higher likelihood of reoffending, but this doesn't systematically vary between the different groups. So if these were statistically distinguishable, we would see few periods of overlap between these hazard curves, but instead, although there are some periods where there are differences, more or less there is considerable overlap in the statistical uncertainty of these curves. So we have considered sexual recidivism events, in particular for a registerable sex offense. So here, a similar pattern emerges where the risk of recidivism is highest right after release and then declines over time. Now, just like with other samples in other states, we find that these sexual recidivism events are exceedingly rare, as demonstrated by the essentially flat survival curve. So it's a very small portion of the sample committing these types of offenses. So what you see here, looking at these hazard curves by our covariates, is that there doesn't seem to be a distinguishable pattern over time. And this is further confirmed by our discrete time survival analysis. So here we can see that there is a lot of statistical uncertainty, and basically we can't distinguish these curves from each other. So the likelihood of recidivism based on prior incarceration or based on the type of original sex offense doesn't statistically differ. Now, based on the discrete time survival analysis that we put together, we are able to produce the following point estimates for cumulative recidivism. Now, it can be difficult to compare these to other samples because of the specificity of the definitions we use and the lack of specificity of other major meta-analyses. So, for instance, a 2005 meta-analysis by Hansen and Morton-Borgen found a sexual recidivism estimate of 13.7% and a general recidivism estimate of 36.2%. But that includes multiple definitions of recidivism. So they had studies that that defined it as arrests, convictions, reincarcerations, multiple things. And they also they had a different follow-up time that was about like 5 to 6 years. So that's pretty different from our results. Another 2006 study by Oliver and Wong, they found a sexual recidivism estimate of 33% and a general recidivism estimate of 59%. Our estimates are obviously much lower than these, but our sample differed a lot. They had a much smaller sample and again used different definitions of recidivism. So it can be difficult to say based on previous literature whether these estimates are particularly high or low, but these are our long-term recidivism estimates for Michigan. Now, so we think these data are really cool, and there's certainly a lot more that can be done. So because of the structure of the data, we could have people in the sample be at risk, recidivate, go to prison, and then potentially be out for observation again. So this would enable us to do a multiple spell survival analysis where we could answer questions like, does recidivism beget recidivism? Or is there a pattern of escalation among recidivism offenses? So additionally, the sentencing file that we have can give us an idea about whether people received a prison sanction for their recidivism event, and we could subsequently look at that association. So considering whether the length of incarceration accelerates or decelerates future recidivism events, just as some examples of what we could do in the future with this data. So that's all I have for you. Thank you all for your time, and you can find more information on the Michigan SAC and the research that's done there on this link below, which I can try and add to the chat.
All right, thank you so much, Katrina, for that fascinating discussion, and the rest of the Michigan team. Katrina, if you can do me a favor and click to the final slide, I'd like to bring Matt Durose back as discussant to lead our question period and offer his reflections.
I just gave the presenter power back to Jason, so he can go to the next one.
All right, thank you. Matt?
Thank you again, Susan. And thank you to each of the presenters as well as Durose for bringing together this group to collectively share their research. As many people know, Durose and the Statistical Analysis Centers have a long history of working together and sharing new research ideas and potential solutions to address research questions. And in my opinion, bringing these projects together helps to enhance the knowledge base for the criminal justice field beyond the outcomes of these individual projects. So thank you again. I do have a couple questions for the panel before we move to questions from the attendees. The first one is for George and Lisa from Maine and Massachusetts. So your research will focus on sex offenders released from prison and placed on probation or parole during 2009 through 2018. As you prepare for the data analysis, are there any changes in policies related to community supervision over time that you're aware of and that might impact the recidivism outcomes for prisoners released during certain years between 2009 and 2018? For instance, certain correctional programs in earlier years versus the more recent years.
Yeah, hey, Matt, that's a great question. And yes, I mean, DOC, I mean, this is going way back, to 2009, and during that intervening period, the Maine Department of Corrections, and I'll just speak to Maine right now, and Lisa can jump in on the Massachusetts part, is yes, they have enacted different policies over the years that, in monitoring sex offenders, they've had various programs. So yes, to your question, that's something that, time permitting, we will discuss with the Maine Department of Corrections, because yes, I mean, with them being more closely monitored or less closely monitored, as the case may be, we may expect higher recidivism rates for like such things as technical violations. So, Lisa, do you want to jump in?
That's a really good question, and I do know that the Department of Corrections has been doing a lot of work around reentry programming, and just in terms of their looking at their the ability to look at their programs, and a lot of strong work on reentry in the community. So I think that's something that obviously we'll be talking about with them, the ability to look at risk to recidivate, and the research that they've done will be incorporated into this work.
Thank you. So my next question is for Matt from Washington. Thank you for your presentation. Your research definitely included some unique attributes, including looking at the annual risk of arrest for the average citizen. And then in the publication itself that you've put together on the study, and in addition to risk levels, I noticed that the analysis included looking at recidivism rates by age groups. And I was wondering if you could just maybe briefly discuss those findings on age.
Absolutely. And I apologize that I don't have a slide to sort of put with this as well. I tried to kind of select and pick and choose as much as I could to try to keep the presentation time down. But we had broken it up by age group. So we had our 18 to 27s, our 28 to 40s, and our 41 and up. And that was at the initial time of registration. So the 18 to 27 group, by the end of year 15, had a 77% rate of arrest, compared to the 41 plus group on the other end, which was a 42% rate of any rearrest at all. The 28s to 40s were in the middle there with a 64% rate. In terms of the curves on those, they kind of followed that same drop-off curve, the same pattern of the overall group, and that was consistent through all of the age groups. And just given the general numbers, I would say, as sort of I think makes general sense, your 41 and up folks hit that level of average community risk before the other groups do. And I think that sort of falls in line with some conventional knowledge on sex offenders in particular, but offenders in general, that as they get older, unless they're a sort of a true career offender, they tend to drop off.
Thanks, Matt. I had one last question on the Michigan study, and some really interesting covariates included in that study on prior incarceration, and also looking at the type of sex offense. And you mentioned future direction might include length of incarceration. I was wondering if there was any other variables or covariates that you considered for this research.
Yeah, absolutely. We also considered looking at whether their original offense was committed against an adult versus a child. That's the one I'm thinking of right now, like one of the main ones. Jason, do you remember any of the others we considered?
Hello, it's Jason Rydberg. Yeah, so on this analysis file that we received, I think we originally had plans to look at like more detailed information on prior criminal history, one of the tasks that we were originally going to help with was calculating age at the start of the period, but I think as a result of some of the pandemic planning, we ended up with a much more restricted data set than I think we had originally planned on starting with. So in the future, we're certainly going to be looking at things like, I think we can easily get gender, race, and age. But for right now, in addition to, so those two, the prior incarceration, the offense type, and then the victim type, that's pretty much what we have to work with for right now.
Okay, thanks again. Susan, I believe we're ready to take some questions from the attendees.
Great, thank you. We have received quite a few questions, and we're going to go ahead and launch the exit poll now, but we'll continue to stay on as long as we have questions. The first question that has already come in could either be for you, Matt, or for Matt Landon. It is for the BJS study referenced by Matt Landon. Did they look at general recidivism or sex offense recidivism? I don't know which of you two Matts wants to take that.
To take it because I feel like that's my error for not being more specific. But it was general. So I didn't mean to necessarily imply that the BJS study was looking at sex offenders only, because it was a much broader scope and it looked at all offenders. But I'll let the other Matt back me up there.
Yes, that is correct. For that 2018 report, that would have been prisoners released for all types of offenses, and the 83% would have been arrested for any type of offense within 9 years. BJS did publish a additional study or additional report from that study that looked just at those released for a sex offense over a 9-year period, and also looked at the percent who were arrested for another sex offense versus other types of offenses. So that second report is available on the BJS website.
Thank you. Another question regarding the Washington State project. Matt, how did you define the term arrest? The questioner does not have a common definition of that term in her state.
A good question. Our criminal history database works off of booking. So it wouldn't necessarily just be a detainment, somebody just being stopped. There's generally got to be a booking, one that would also produce a fingerprint. That's sort of the level of entry into that system.
Thank you. And another question for you. Can you talk a little bit more about how you calculated the population average arrest for comparative purposes?
Sure. So this is sort of why I mentioned that this is a more of a rough statistic and not one that I would think. I took the 2010 census and the estimates around it and basically gathered a full statewide estimate of adults. So everyone who was 18 and up between 2000 and 2008. 2010 was the census year, and that's sort of the midpoint, rough midpoint in that range. That would be total, and I subtract the number of people in the cohort from that total to make a huge difference, because there's millions of people in the state and several thousand cohorts. So, don't want to count anybody. And then I put the number of arrests in the criminal history data for those years that were not associated with anyone in the cohort, and attributed that to the larger population of Washington. There are some very obvious flaws in that particular method because it's not necessarily comparing apples to apples. But what I wanted to gather was essentially the relative risk that a random person in the community, picked at random, might be arrested in a given year, who is not necessarily part of the cohort. And then compare that number to those at risk of their first arrest. So I think that number could absolutely be refined if we wanted to get a very specific and correct, or I should say a precise number for the average risk. But in terms of the general level, I think it's in the ballpark, certainly. And in comparing the percentages, I think it's still a very useful metric, at least as a starting point.
Thank you. I do think we're having a little bit of the interference from the high winds that you had warned us about.
I know.
Let's continue to power through. We actually have two more questions for you. And folks, if you have any additional questions, please do enter them in the chat box. The next question is, were most of the offenders in the Washington study in your cohort being supervised in the community, either on probation or parole?
The simple answer to that is yes. Washington's probation parole system is a little bit different from other states, but one thing that is sort of a constant is anybody who is registered as a sex offender has a level of supervision that I think is at least comparable to what you would expect essentially of Department of Corrections supervision in another state. Also, I read the second question. Can I power through to that one?
Sure.
So the second question there was about including offenders who were civilly committed to the Special Commitment Center. I want to give just a little bit of background on that for folks who are unfamiliar with Washington system. We have a center on McNeil Island where sex offenders can be civilly committed if they are found too dangerous to release into the community after serving a prison sentence. And so they can be civilly committed to that center and spend time there. And it is possible for them, while in that center, to be found eligible for release back into the community. So they will leave the commitment center there. So the question was if we had included those people, those releases in the study, and if not, what impact that would have. So those people were included in the study because when they release into the community, they have to register like anybody else and still get their level. So I don't know which ones in the study they were, but they were in the study by virtue of having to register upon release. And that was part of the reason we used that as the entry variable to identify people in the study. I asked, while we were going through more presentation, I asked a coworker to take a look and found that there were 6 total releases from the SCC between 2000 and 2003, and there was no unconditional release until 2005. So in the time period of the study, we just had 6 folks who would have come from the Special Commitment Center, and they would have been included because of their need to register. So I hope that answers that.
Yes, thank you very much. Now, before I turn things back to Matt Durose for any final comment and to say goodbye, I'd like to remind everyone to please take that exit poll before you sign off. And now, Matt, anything further from you?
I just wanted to once again thank the presenters and the JRSA staff, and also remind everyone about the panel that will be going on tomorrow and also on Thursday.
Thanks so much. Thanks everyone for your time today, and we hope to see you later this week. Goodbye.